I looked at the bills scattered across the kitchen table, not knowing what to do. They were like white flags of surrender. I wasn't ready to wave, but the war was clearly being lost. The morning light filtered through the gingham curtains, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Texas dust, the kind that gets into your soul and never really leaves. It was quiet in the house, a silence that used to be peaceful when Thomas was alive. But now, 2 years after the accident, it just felt heavy, like the air before a tornado. The coffee in my mug had gone cold, a dark, bitter mirror reflecting a woman I barely recognized anymore. I was tired. Not the kind of tired a good night's sleep can fix, but the bone-deep exhaustion of holding up a sky that keeps falling. I ran my hand over the rough wood of the table. Thomas had built this table. He had built this life, and now the bank was threatening to take it all away because of a bad harvest and a worse economy. I picked up the final notice, the red ink screaming at me. I had one shot left, one meeting in Dallas with a loan officer named Jason Miller. They said he was a shark, a rising star in wealth management who handled the difficult cases. I didn't feel like a difficult case. I felt like a desperate widow trying to keep the only home her children had ever known. I grabbed my purse, the leather worn soft at the edges, and walked out to the truck. The screen door slammed shut behind me with a familiar whack, a sound that echoed across the empty porch. The drive to Dallas was a blur of highway lines and anxious prayers. I rehearsed what I would say, practicing my plea for dignity, for time, for mercy. The landscape changed from the rolling, mesquite-dotted hills of my home to the concrete sprawl of the city. The skyline of Dallas rose up like a fortress of glass and steel, indifferent to the dirt under my fingernails. Entering the bank tower felt like stepping onto another planet. The air was artificially cool, smelling of expensive cologne and industrial cleaner. My boots, polished as best as I could manage, but still showing the scuffs of ranch work, clicked loudly on the marble floor. I felt small, I felt invisible. The receptionist, a young woman with a headset and a perfectly practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes, directed me to the 40th floor. "Mr. Miller is on a tight schedule," she warned me, handing me a visitor's badge that felt like a brand. "You have 15 minutes. The elevator ride made my ears pop. When the doors slid open, I stepped into a world of beige carpets and glass walls. I found the office at the end of the hall. Jason Miller was sitting behind a desk that looked more like a landing strip than furniture. He was young, younger than I expected, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my truck. He didn't stand up when I entered. He didn't offer a hand. He just pointed to the chair opposite him with a Mont Blanc pen, not even looking up from his tablet. "Sit," he said. It wasn't an invitation, it was a command. I sat, clutching my purse like a shield. "Mr. Miller, thank you for seeing me. I know my accounts are behind, but with the drought last season and the medical bills from my late husband—" "Mrs. Reynolds," he interrupted, finally looking at me. His eyes were cold, calculating, devoid of any warmth. "I've reviewed the file. The bank isn't a charity. Your land value has depreciated. Your liquidity is non-existent. We're initiating foreclosure proceedings on the 1st of the month." The breath left my lungs. "But I have a harvest coming in. The cattle are healthy. I just need an extension. 6 months, please." Jason sighed, a dramatic, exaggerated sound of boredom. He began clicking his pen against the glass table. Click, click, click. The sound was sharp, rhythmic, and incredibly irritating. "It's simple math," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You can't afford the ranch, sell it, move to an apartment. Stop pretending you can play cowboy in this economy." Tears stung my eyes, hot and humiliating. I opened my mouth to argue, to fight, but the words died in my throat. He wasn't listening. He was checking his watch. He was already mentally at lunch. I was just a nuisance, a fly he was waiting to swat away. I was gathering my things, my hands shaking with a mixture of rage and grief, when the heavy glass door to the office opened. The receptionist didn't announce anyone. A man just walked in. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. It wasn't a loud entrance, it was the opposite. It was a grounding presence, like a mountain suddenly appearing in the middle of the ocean. The man was older, dressed in a crisp, button-down shirt, Wranglers that had seen actual work, and a resistol hat that cast a shadow over his eyes. He carried a battered leather briefcase. I froze. I knew that silhouette. Every person in Texas knew that silhouette. It was George Strait. But Jason Miller didn't look up. He was still typing on his computer, clearly annoyed at the interruption. He assumed in his arrogance that this was just another desperate rancher who had bypassed security. "I told the girl at the front desk no walk-ins," Jason snapped, not even turning his head. "I'm busy dealing with—" He gestured vaguely at me with his pen. "This situation. You'll have to wait outside." George didn't move, he didn't speak. He just stood there, just inside the door, looking at Jason with a calmness that was unnerving. I sank back into my chair, terrified to move, terrified to breathe. I wanted to warn Jason. I wanted to scream, "Do you know who that is?" But my voice failed me. I was paralyzed by the sheer absurdity of the moment. Jason finally spun his chair around, his face flushed with irritation. "Did you hear me? I said get out. I have a lunch meeting at the club in 20 minutes, and I don't have time for another sob story about a tractor loan." George took one step forward. The sound of his boot on the carpet was soft, deliberate. He looked at me first, tipping his hat slightly. His eyes were kind, a stark contrast to the icy stare of the banker. It was a look that said, "I see you, ma'am. Stay put." Then he turned his gaze to Jason. "I'm not here for a tractor loan, son," George said. His voice was exactly like it was on the radio, smooth, deep, and steady as a heartbeat. Jason rolled his eyes, letting out a scoff that sounded like a bark. "Look, old-timer," Jason said, standing up to assert dominance, though he still looked small compared to the presence of the man in the hat. "I don't care what you're here for. This is the Wealth Management Division. The consumer loans for people like you are on the second floor. Now, if you don't leave, I'm calling security." I watched George's face. There was no anger there, no ego, just a profound, deep stillness. He walked over to the empty chair next to mine and sat down. He placed his briefcase on the table. He moved with a slowness that was almost hypnotic, a direct challenge to the frantic, high-speed energy Jason radiated. "I think I'll stay right here," George said quietly. Jason's face turned a shade of crimson I had never seen before. He slammed his hand down on the desk. "Who do you think you are? You can't just barge in here and sit down. Do you have any idea who I am? I manage portfolios larger than your entire hometown's GDP. George just looked at him. He didn't blink, he didn't flinch, and then the silence began. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a heavy, physical thing. It filled the room, pressing against the glass walls. Jason waited for a retort, for an argument, for the man to start yelling back so he could justify kicking him out. But George gave him nothing. He just sat there, hands folded on his lap, watching Jason with the patience of a man who has spent hours waiting for a stubborn calf to move. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. For the last 30 minutes, Jason had made me feel worthless. He had used words as weapons to strip away my dignity. But now, in the face of this absolute silence, Jason was the one unraveling. Jason picked up his pen again. Click, click, click. Faster this time. "Fine," Jason spat. "You want to play the strong, silent type? Let's see how that works for you. I'm calling security right now." He reached for the phone, his fingers trembling slightly. "So you might want to check your system first," George said. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't even lean forward. Jason paused, the receiver halfway to his ear. "Excuse me?" "My name," George said. "Check it in your system before you make that call." Jason laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "Oh, I see. You're a VIP in your own mind? Okay, cowboy, let's humor you. What's the name? Bubba? Tex?" "Strait," George said softly. "George Strait." Jason typed the name into his computer with aggressive, stabbing keystrokes, shaking his head the whole time. "Strait. Right. Like I'm supposed to be impressed by—" His voice trailed off. I watched the color drain from Jason's face. It started at his chin and went all the way up to his hairline, leaving him pale and waxen. His eyes widened, staring at the screen. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The clicking of the pen stopped. The hum of the air conditioner seemed to get louder. Jason looked up from the screen, then at the man in the hat, then back at the screen. His arrogance was evaporating like water on hot asphalt. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. Mr. Strait, Jason stammered. His voice had jumped an octave. The George Strait. George didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just leaned back in the chair, crossing one leg over the other. I believe that's what it says on the account. Jason scrambled to stand up, knocking over his expensive pen holder. Sir, I had no idea. The receptionist didn't... usually clients of your magnitude, they come through the private entrance. I apologize. I severely apologize. Sit down, son, George said. Jason sat, collapsing into his chair as if his strings had been cut. He was sweating now, visible beads forming on his forehead. How can I help you, Mr. Strait? Whatever you need. Transfers? Investments? I can get the branch manager here in 2 seconds. We'll get to that, George said. He turned his head slowly and looked at me. I wanted to disappear. I was the witness to his humiliation, the poor widow who had just been evicted by this man. I clutched my purse tighter, looking down at my boots. What was your name again, Ma'am? George asked me. I looked up, startled. Sarah, I whispered. Sarah Reynolds. George nodded. Sarah. He turned back to Jason. Now, before we talk about my money, I couldn't help but overhear the end of your conversation with Mrs. Reynolds here. Sounds to me like she's in a bit of a bind. Jason looked panicked, his eyes darting between me and the billionaire cowboy. Oh, that's just standard procedure, Mr. Strait. Low-yield asset, high risk. We have strict protocols. It's nothing you need to worry about. Just business. Business, George repeated the word like it tasted bad. You know, I've been in business a long time. Bought my first few acres when I didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. A banker back then, old man named Higgins. He looked me in the eye and shook my hand. Didn't look at a computer, looked at me. He bet on the man, not the numbers. George paused, letting the silence stretch again. It was agonizing for Jason. I could see the young banker's mind racing, trying to figure out how to salvage the situation, how to pivot, how to manipulate this into a win. But you can't manipulate a rock. You can't charm a thunderstorm. I've been banking here for 30 years, George continued, his voice low. Kept my money here because I thought this place understood Texas values. But watching how you treat a lady, he shook his head slowly. It makes me wonder if my money is safe here. If a bank loses its soul, the money usually follows. Mr. Strait, please, Jason pleaded, his hands raised in surrender. I was just doing my job. The metrics, the algorithm. The algorithm didn't build this city, son. People did. George reached out and tapped the folder in front of Jason, my folder. Let me see those papers. Jason hesitated. Sir, technically, that's confidential client information. I can't just... George just looked at him. The look wasn't threatening, but it was absolute. It was the look of a father disappointed in a child who should know better. Jason handed over the folder with a trembling hand. George opened it. He put on a pair of reading glasses he pulled from his shirt pocket. The room was dead silent. I could hear my own heart hammering against my ribs. George Strait was reading my foreclosure notice. It felt surreal, like a dream induced by fever and stress. He scanned the pages, his finger tracing the lines of debt and interest. 2 bad years, George murmured, more to himself than to us. Drought in 22, market crash in 23, husband passed. He paused, looking up at me. I'm sorry for your loss, Ma'am. Thank you, I choked out, the tears finally spilling over. He looked back at the papers. Then he looked at Jason. She's not broke, son, she's just stuck. There's equity in the land. The herd is good. She just needs time. The bank can't give time, Jason said, his voice weak, trying to cling to the shreds of his corporate authority. Policy dictates that after 90 days. Change the policy, George said simply. I can't. I don't have that authorization. George closed the folder. He took off his glasses and put them back in his pocket. He stared at Jason for a long moment. That silence again. It was suffocating. I saw Jason squirm, adjusting his tie, checking his watch, looking at the door. He was trapped. "Well," George said, standing up, "if you can't do it, I guess I need to talk to someone who can." Jason shot up. "I can get the director. I can get him right now." "No need," George said. He reached into his briefcase. I thought he was going to pull out a checkbook. Instead, he pulled out a single, thick envelope. It was old, manila, and stuffed with papers. He placed it gently on the glass table. "I came here today to deposit the proceeds from the sale of my development in San Antonio," George said. "It's a substantial amount, 8 figures. I wanted to put it into your long-term trust funds." Jason's eyes bulged. He was practically salivating. Yes, absolutely. We can handle that immediately. I can set up the portfolio right now. We have excellent rates for—" George held up a hand. "But," he interrupted, "I have a rule. I don't do business with people who don't know the difference between price and value. You know the price of this lady's farm, but you don't know the value of her word. And that tells me everything I need to know about you." George picked the envelope back up. He put it back in his briefcase. "I think I'm in the wrong bank," George said. The blood drained from Jason's face so completely, he looked like a ghost. "Mr. Strait, please, don't leave. We can fix this. I can look at her file again. I can make an exception." George paused. He looked at Jason, then he looked at me. He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that made the corners of his eyes crinkle. "It's not about the file anymore, son," George said. "It's about the silence." The silence?" Jason asked, bewildered. "Yeah, the silence you gave her when she asked for help, and the silence you gave me when you thought I was nobody." George put his hat back on, adjusting the brim. "You thought it was simple, just numbers on a screen, but you forgot that every number is a person's life." He turned to me. "Sarah, would you mind walking with me? I think there's a bank across the street that might have better coffee, and I have a feeling they might be looking for some new investments in local agriculture." I stood up, my legs shaky. I looked at Jason. He was slumped in his chair, defeated, staring at the empty space on the table where the millions of dollars had been for a fleeting second. The clicking of his pen had stopped forever. "I'd like that, Mr. Strait," I said. We walked out of the office together, leaving the cold, sterile air behind. As we passed the receptionist, she looked up, confused to see the tractor loan man leaving with the distraught widow, both of us walking tall. But the story didn't end there. That was just the moment the door opened. The real journey, the lesson that changed my life, was what happened in the silence that followed, on the walk to the elevator, and the words he spoke to me when the world wasn't watching. Because George Strait didn't just save my farm that day, he taught me that the loudest power in the room isn't the one shouting. It's the one that knows exactly who it is without saying a word. And as we stepped into the elevator, leaving Jason to his ruin, I realized that my problems were far from over. But for the first time in 2 years, I wasn't fighting them alone. The elevator doors slid shut, sealing us inside a mirrored box that smelled faintly of lemon polish and old money. The silence that descended wasn't the heavy, suffocating kind that had filled Jason Miller's office. It was a vacuum, a sudden suspension of reality. I stared at my reflection in the brushed steel doors, a woman with frayed nerves, wearing a plaid shirt that had been washed too many times, standing next to a living legend. My hands were shaking. Not a little tremble, but a violent vibration that rattled the brass buckles on my purse. I clenched my fists to stop it, but the adrenaline crash was hitting me like a physical blow. I had walked into that building ready to beg for my life, been crushed and then resurrected, all in the span of 20 minutes. "Breathe," a deep voice said. I looked over. George wasn't looking at me. He was watching the floor numbers count down. 39, 38, 37. I can't believe that just happened," I stammered, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the small space. "I don't even know what to say. Mr. Strait, you didn't have to—" "George," he corrected gently. He turned to me then, and up close the lines around his eyes told a story of 1,000 miles traveled. And yes, I did. My daddy taught me a long time ago that there are 2 kinds of people in this world, those who build fences and those who tear them down. That boy upstairs, he's never built a thing in his life. The elevator dinged at the lobby level, the doors opened, and the noise of the busy Dallas street rushed in to meet us. Honking horns, the murmur of the crowd, the chaotic rhythm of the city. It felt aggressive compared to the quiet of the elevator. "My truck's out back," he said, adjusting his hat, "but I think we need something stronger than bank water before we talk business. You hungry?" I realized then that I hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. My stomach gave a treacherous growl. "I could eat," I admitted, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. "Good. I know a place. It's not fancy, but they don't charge you for the air conditioning." We walked out of the glass tower. I felt the eyes of the doormen on us, or rather on him. People stopped mid-stride on the sidewalk. Phones were raised. Whispers rippled through the air like wind through wheat. "Is that? No way." "It is." George ignored it all with a practiced ease, moving through the attention like a ship cutting through small waves. He led me not to a limousine, but to a heavy-duty black pickup truck parked in a loading zone. It was dusty. Not the fake dust spray painted on for a commercial, but real caked-on Texas mud on the wheel wells. He opened the passenger door for me. As I climbed up, the smell hit me. Saddle soap, diesel, and peppermint. It smelled like my father's truck. It smelled like Thomas's truck. It smelled like safety. We drove for about 10 minutes, leaving the high-rise district behind for a neighborhood of brick warehouses and older establishments. He pulled into a diner called the Rusty Spur. The neon sign was buzzing, the R flickering intermittently. Inside, it was a sanctuary of red vinyl booths and checkerboard floors. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with hair the color of steel wool, looked up as the bell on the door jingled. Her eyes went wide, then narrowed into a smile. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I thought you were in Nashville, George." "Got lost, Martha," he grinned. "Found a friend instead. We need a booth in the back, and 2 slices of that pecan pie. The fresh one, not the one you've been hiding since Tuesday." We sat in the back corner, secluded from the rest of the room. When the coffee arrived, steaming, black, and strong enough to wake the dead, George finally took off his hat and placed it on the seat beside him. He looked at me, really looked at me, with that same analytical, quiet gaze he had used on the banker. "Talk to me, Sarah," he said, "and don't give me the bank version. Tell me the truth. How bad is it?" I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, anchoring myself. I looked down at the swirling dark liquid. It's bad," I whispered. "Thomas died 2 years ago. Tractor accident. He was the one who understood the numbers. He handled the futures, the feed costs, the rotation. I was the heart, he was the head." I took a breath, fighting the lump in my throat. When he passed, the life insurance money went to the funeral and the immediate debts. But then the drought hit in 22. We lost 30 head of cattle to heat stress. Then the feed prices doubled. I took out that loan with Jason's bank to try and pivot to organic feed, thinking I could get a premium price. But the market softened. I'm sitting on inventory I can't move, land that's thirsty, and a bank account that's been in the red for 6 months. I looked up at him, expecting to see pity. I hated pity. It felt like charity. But there was no pity in his eyes. There was respect. "You kept the herd?" he asked. "I kept what I could," I said fiercely. "I sold the equipment before I sold the breeding stock. That bloodline goes back 40 years. My daddy started it. I couldn't let them go to the slaughterhouse just to pay a man like Jason Miller." George nodded slowly. He took a forkful of the pie Martha had set down. "You sold the tractor to keep the cows. That's a rancher's choice. A banker would have told you to sell the cows to keep the tractor because the tractor doesn't eat." "Exactly," I said, leaning forward. "But you can't breed a tractor. You can't build a future on rust and oil. The cows are the legacy." "Legacy," George repeated the word. He leaned back, the vinyl booth creaking. "That's a heavy word, Sarah. Sometimes it's too heavy to carry alone." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notepad and a pen, a cheap plastic click pen, not a Mont Blanc. He scribbled a name and a number on it. "This is a man named Henry Vance. He runs a community bank in Fort Worth. It's not a glass tower, it's a brick building on Main Street. I've already sent him a text. He's expecting your call in the morning." I stared at the paper. "I don't understand. My credit score is shot. My debt-to-income ratio is—" "Henry doesn't care about the ratio as much as he cares about the character," George interrupted. "I'm moving my development funds to his bank. As part of that deposit, I've asked him to refinance a few specific high-risk loans that I believe have potential. Yours is at the top of the stack." My heart stopped. You're paying it off?" "No," George said firmly. The softness left his voice, replaced by the steel of a man who worked for everything he had. "I'm not paying a dime of your debt, Sarah. If I did that, I'd be stealing your victory. You dug this hole, partially by bad luck, partially by grief. You have to climb out of it. What I'm doing is dropping a ladder. Henry will buy out the loan from Jason's bank. He'll give you a lower interest rate and a 2-year grace period on the principal. You'll just pay interest. That gives you breathing room." He leaned in closer. "But there's a catch." I swallowed hard. "What's the catch?" "I want to see the ranch. Now? Right now. I want to see what I'm vouching for. I want to see this bloodline you fought so hard to keep. And I want to see if you've got the grit to finish what Thomas started." The drive to my ranch, located about an hour south of Dallas, was quiet. But this time, it was a companionable silence. George drove with one hand on the wheel, humming along to the radio. Ironically, a Merle Haggard song, not one of his own. I watched the city fade into suburbs, and the suburbs dissolve into the open plains of North Texas. The sun was beginning to dip low, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. As we turned onto the gravel road leading to my property, the shame hit me again. The entrance gate was leaning precariously. The white paint on the fences was peeling, revealing grey, weathered wood underneath. The grass in the front pasture was overgrown. To the untrained eye, it looked like abandonment. To me, it looked like exhaustion. It's not in the best shape," I apologized, looking out the window. "I haven't had the money for hands. It's just me and my son Cody when he's not at school." George slowed the truck down, navigating the potholes with care. "Paint don't make beef, Sarah. Don't apologize for the work you haven't got to yet. Apologize only for the work you're scared to do." We pulled up to the main house. It was a modest Victorian farmhouse, once proud, now tired. My old dog, Buster, limped off the porch, barking half-heartedly before wagging his tail as I stepped out. George got out and stood by the truck, taking a deep breath of the air. It smelled of dry grass and coming rain. "Good land," he said. "Deep soil. I can smell the clay." "The herd is in the back pasture," I said. "We can take the truck part of the way." We drove back, past the barn with the sagging roof, out to where the land opened up. And there they were. 50 head of Hereford Angus cross. They looked up as we approached, their dark eyes watching us. George walked up to the fence line. He didn't just look. He studied. He watched how they moved, how they clustered. He checked the calves. He was silent for a long time. I stood beside him, twisting my hands, waiting for the verdict. Then he pointed to the far corner of the pasture. "That fence post is down." I looked. Sure enough, a cedar post had snapped at the base, dragging the barbed wire down into the dirt. A calf was sniffing at the gap, dangerously close to wandering into the creek bed where the coyotes denned. "Oh no," I gasped. "I just checked that yesterday. The rot must have finally—" I started to run toward it. "Hold on," George said. He walked back to his truck and dropped the tailgate. To my amazement, he pulled out a pair of fencing pliers and a pair of heavy leather gloves. He tossed the gloves to me. "You got any spare wire in the barn?" he asked. "Yes, but—" "Mr. Strait, you can't. You're wearing a dress shirt. I'm a rancher, Sarah. And right now, your cows are about to get loose. Go get the wire." I ran. I ran faster than I had in years. I grabbed the spool of wire from the barn and sprinted back. When I got there, George Strait, the king of country, the man who sold out stadiums, was on his knees in the dirt. He had already wrestled the old post out of the ground and was bracing the wire with his shoulder. His pristine shirt was stained with red dust. Sweat was beading on his forehead. "Pull that slack," he grunted, nodding at the wire. I dropped to my knees beside him. I grabbed the wire, the metal biting into the leather gloves. We worked in tandem, a rhythm as old as the West. Pull, twist, clip, pull, twist, clip. There were no words, just the grunts of effort and the sound of metal snapping into place. We fought that fence for 20 minutes, sweating, straining, until the gap was closed and the wire sang tight when he plucked it. He stood up, wiping his forehead with the back of his arm, leaving a streak of dirt across his face. He looked at the repaired fence, then at me. I was panting, my hair a mess, my knees covered in mud. "That'll hold," he said. I don't know how to thank you," I said, breathless. "Don't thank me," he said, putting the pliers away. "That right there, that's the collateral. The fence, the sweat," he said. "I watched you, Sarah. You didn't hesitate. You didn't ask me to do it for you. You got down in the dirt. That tells me you're not drowning. You're swimming. You just needed someone to point out where the shore was." The sun was setting now, casting long, dramatic shadows across the field. The cattle had settled down, chewing their cud, the crisis averted. We leaned against the side of his truck, watching the light fade. "It's going to be hard," George said quietly, looking out at the horizon. "Henry will give you the loan, but the payments will still be tight. You're going to have to sell off the back 40 acres to capitalize the operation. It'll hurt. It was your daddy's land, but you have to amputate the limb to save the body." I felt a sharp pang in my chest. Sell the creek bottom? Thomas loved that spot. "Thomas isn't here to pay the bills, Sarah," George said. It was harsh, but his tone was gentle. "You are. And if you keep holding on to the past with both hands, you don't have a hand free to grab the future. You sell the back 40, you fix the barn, you buy the feed. In 3 years, you'll be in the black. Then if you want, you buy the land back. But right now, you have to survive." He turned to face me. The twilight made his eyes look even darker, more intense. "Jason Miller looked at you and saw a statistic. I look at you and I see a storm. You've got power, Sarah, but a storm without direction just destroys things. You need to channel it." He reached out and tipped my chin up slightly with a gloved finger. It wasn't romantic, it was paternal, authoritative. "Tomorrow morning you call Henry. You sign the papers, you list the back 40, and you paint that front gate, you hear me? You paint it white. Because when people drive by, they need to know that this ranch isn't dying. They need to know the Reynolds family is still in business." I nodded, tears streaming down my dusty face. "I will, I promise." "Good." He pushed off the truck. "Now, I've got a long drive back to San Antonio, and my wife is going to kill me for ruining this shirt." He climbed into the truck and started the engine. The rumble of the diesel was loud in the quiet evening. He rolled down the window. "One more thing, Sarah." "Yes, George?" "Silence is a powerful tool when you're dealing with fools like Jason. But when you're dealing with God or yourself, don't be silent. Ask for what you need, scream if you have to. Just don't ever let the silence swallow you up again." He touched the brim of his hat, put the truck in gear and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust that glowed orange in the sunset. I stood there until his taillights disappeared. I was alone again. The crickets were starting their nightly chorus. The weight of the debt was still there, technically. The barn was still broken, the grief was still a hole in my chest. But as I looked down at my hands, still wearing the leather gloves he had tossed me, I realized something had changed. The fear was gone. I walked back to the house, my boots crunching on the gravel. I didn't go inside immediately. Instead, I went to the shed. I dug around in the darkness until I found it, a half-empty can of white exterior paint and a stiff brush. I walked out to the front gate. It was dark now, lit only by the moon and the porch light. My muscles ached. I was exhausted, but I pried the lid off the can. I dipped the brush in. Slap. The first stroke of white paint covered the grey, rotting wood. It was bright. It was clean. It was a declaration of war against the decay. Slap. Slap. I worked into the night. I thought the hard part was over. I thought the meeting with the banker was the climax of my struggle. I was wrong. The rescue wasn't the end of the story. It was just the prologue. George had given me the weapon, but I was the one who had to fight the battle. And as I painted, I didn't know that the sky to the north was turning a bruised, ugly green. I didn't know that while I was saving my home from the bank, nature was gathering its breath for a different kind of test. The silence of the night felt peaceful, but it was a liar. The real noise was about to begin. The wind didn't howl. It screamed. It was a sound that tore through the darkness, stripping the leaves off the mesquite trees and rattling the loose tin on the barn roof like a drummer on a warped snare. The peaceful silence George and I had shared earlier was gone, replaced by the chaotic fury of a North Texas squall line. I was still at the gate, the white paint wet and sticky on the wood, when the first drop hit my cheek. It felt like a pebble. Within seconds, the sky opened up. It wasn't just rain. It was a deluge, a vertical river trying to drown the earth. I capped the paint can, my hands fumbling in the slick wetness, and threw the brush into the bucket. "Buster! Inside! Now!" I yelled, my voice swallowed instantly by a crack of thunder that shook the ground beneath my boots. I didn't run for the house, I ran for the barn, the herd, the calves. George had helped me fix the perimeter fence, but the cattle were huddled near the creek bed for shelter, the very place that would flash flood in a storm like this. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to seize my chest. This was the test. George had said, "I see a storm in you." Well, now the storm was outside, and I had to decide which one was stronger. I grabbed a flashlight from the truck and sprinted into the pasture. The mud sucked at my boots, trying to drag me down with every step. The rain was blinding, coming down in sheets so thick I could barely see 5 feet in front of me. "Hee-yah! Move! Get up!" I waved my arms, screaming at the dark shapes of the cows. They were spooked, eyes wide and reflecting the flashlight beam, milling around in confusion. The water in the creek was already rising, a churning brown snake widening by the second. If they stayed there, the calves would be swept away. That was my future washing downriver. That was the loan payment. That was the trust George Strait had placed in me. I slipped, falling hard into the mud. The cold muck filled my mouth. I laid there for a second, the rain hammering my back. It would be so easy to just stay down, to let the storm win, to let the bank take it all. "It's too hard," a voice whispered in my head. "You're just one woman." Then I remembered the feeling of the leather gloves George had tossed me. I remembered him on his knees in the dirt, ruining a shirt that cost more than my monthly grocery bill just to hold a line. He didn't do it for the cow. He did it for me, because he thought I was worth the sweat. I pushed myself up. I spat the mud out. I wasn't just Sarah the widow anymore. I was the owner of the Reynolds Ranch. I grabbed a fallen branch and waded into the herd. I didn't ask them to move. I made them move. I hollered with a voice I didn't know I possessed, a guttural, primal sound that cut through the wind. I slapped the rumps of the stragglers. I physically shoved a 1,000-pound heifer away from the rising water. One by one they turned. They began to trudge up the slope toward the barn. I counted them in the flashes of lightning. 48, 49, 50. I followed them up, soaked to the bone, shivering violently, but burning with a fire that had nothing to do with temperature. We made it to the barn. I shoved the heavy sliding door shut and dropped the latch just as a massive gust of wind slammed against the wood, shaking the entire structure. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of wet fur and hay. The cows were safe. I slid down the wall and sat on the dirt floor, my head between my knees, gasping for air. I had saved them. I had done it alone. The storm raged for 3 hours. I didn't sleep. I sat there in the dark, listening to the violence outside, planning. I mentally calculated the feed costs. I rehearsed what I would say to Henry Vance. I visualized the for sale sign on the back 40 acres. I wasn't afraid of the math anymore. The math was just a storm on paper, and I knew how to weather storms now. When dawn broke, the silence returned. But it was different this time. It was the silence of survival. I stepped out of the barn into a world that looked like it had been chewed up and spit out. Tree limbs littered the yard. The gravel driveway was washed out. But the gate, my half-painted white gate, was still standing. The paint was streaked and imperfect, but it was bright against the grey morning. I walked to the house to change. My phone was on the kitchen counter, blinking with a missed message. It wasn't from a creditor. It wasn't a threat. It was a text from a number I didn't have saved, but I recognized the area code. "Hope you and the herd are dry. The sun always comes out eventually. GS." I stared at the screen, a tired smile cracking my face. He knew. He had probably watched the radar all night, worrying about the investment he had made in a stranger. I didn't text back. I didn't have time. I showered, scrubbed the mud from my skin, put on my best blazer, the one I wore to church, and drove to Fort Worth. Henry Vance's bank was exactly as George had described, a brick building on Main Street with a bell above the door. It smelled of old paper and coffee, not sanitizer and fear. Henry was a man in his 60s with suspenders and a face that looked like a friendly bulldog. He had the paperwork ready on his desk. "George told me about you," Henry said, peering over his spectacles. "Said you have a good eye for fences." "I'm learning," I said, sitting straight. "Mr. Vance, before we sign, I need you to know something. I'm listing the creek bottom acreage today. The proceeds will go directly to the principal of this loan. I've run the numbers. It tightens my operation, but it guarantees I can make your payments." Henry smiled. It was a genuine smile. "I know, George told me you'd say that." He said, "She won't ask for a handout, Henry. She'll offer a trade." "That's why I'm signing this loan, Mrs. Reynolds. Collateral is just land. Character is currency." I signed the papers. My hand didn't shake. The next 2 years were the hardest of my life. I didn't see George Strait again during that time. There were no more magical visits, no checks in the mail. There was just the grind. I sold the back 40 acres. Watching the surveyor drive stakes into the land my father had walked on felt like a physical amputation. I cried that day, standing on the porch, watching a developer map out where new houses would go. But then I looked at the barn, which now had a repaired roof. I looked at the herd, which had grown to 60 head. I looked at the bank statement, which was finally, miraculously, in the black. I had traded sentiment for survival. It was a fair trade. I finished painting the gate. I planted wildflowers along the driveway. I negotiated better feed prices. I fired a distributor who tried to cheat me. I became the woman George had seen in the elevator, not the woman who had walked into it. One Tuesday afternoon, about 18 months after the meeting in Dallas, I had to go into the city to sign some final deed transfers. I was walking down the street, feeling the pavement under my boots, when I decided to stop for a sandwich. I walked into a generic fluorescent-lit deli. It was lunch rush. The line was long. I stood there checking my emails on my phone, business emails, orders for beef, when I heard a voice I recognized. "Next guest, please. Can I take your order?" The voice was flat, tired, stripped of all its glossy arrogance. I looked up. Behind the counter, wearing a green apron and a paper hat, was Jason Miller. He looked older. The sharp Italian suit was gone, replaced by a uniform that was slightly too big for him. The expensive haircut had grown out. He looked like a man who had been humbled by gravity. I stepped up to the register. He was looking down at the screen, punching in a code. "What can I get for you?" he asked, not looking up. "I'll have the turkey club," I said, "and maybe a little more respect than you gave me last time." Jason froze. His head snapped up. His eyes locked onto mine, and I saw the flash of recognition, followed immediately by a wave of shame so potent I could almost smell it. Mrs. Reynolds," he whispered. His face went pale. He looked around nervously, as if expecting George Strait to materialize from the soda fountain. "Hello, Jason," I said calmly. I heard you kept the ranch," he stammered. He looked at my clothes, clean, professional, confident. "I heard you turned it around." "I did. He looked down at his hands. "I lost my job, obviously. After the incident, word got around. No firm in Dallas would touch me. They said I was a liability." "You were," I said. It wasn't an insult, it was a fact. He swallowed hard. "I'm sorry, I never said it back then. I was too scared, but I'm sorry. I treated you like a number." The old Sarah might have gloated. She might have enjoyed seeing the shark reduced to a minnow. But the new Sarah, the one who had weathered the storm and fixed the fence, felt something different. I felt a strange kind of peace. "George told me something that day," I said, leaning slightly over the counter. "He said silence is a tool. You used your silence to make me feel small. But silence can also be used to listen. Are you listening now, Jason?" He nodded, his eyes wet. "Yes, ma'am, I am." "Good. Then you'll be all right." I placed a $20 bill on the counter. "Keep the change." I walked out of the deli without looking back. I didn't need his apology to validate me. My validation was in the dirt under my fingernails and the gate standing tall at the end of my driveway. 6 months later, the rodeo came to San Antonio. It was the biggest event of the year, and the headliner, as always, was the king. I bought a ticket, not a VIP pass, not a backstage access, just a regular seat in the stands surrounded by thousands of people wearing cowboy hats and boots. The arena was electric, buzzing with that specific Texas energy that feels like a family reunion. When the lights went down, the roar was deafening, and then the spotlight hit the center stage. There he was, George Strait. He looked exactly the same as he did in the bank office, calm, steady, unbothered by the chaos around him. He picked up his guitar, flashed that crooked smile that had broken a million hearts, and strummed the first chord. The crowd sang along to every word. I sang too. But for me, it wasn't just music. It was a soundtrack to a resurrection. Midway through the set, the music slowed down. He adjusted the microphone. The stadium went quiet, a respectful, anticipating silence. "I want to dedicate this next one," George said, his voice echoing through the massive speakers. "To everyone out there who's fighting a battle nobody else sees, to the folks who are holding up the sky when their arms are tired. I met a lady a while back who reminded me that the Texas spirit isn't about how much money you have in the bank. It's about how much fight you have in your heart." He didn't say my name, he didn't point me out, he didn't have to. He started playing The Weight of the Badge, but in my head, I heard the words he had spoken to me in the truck. "Paint, don't make beef. Apologize only for the work you're scared to do." I stood there in the dark, tears streaming down my face, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude. I looked at the man on stage, a man who could have bought my ranch 100 times over, but instead chose to teach me how to keep it. He hadn't saved me. That was the most important lesson of all. He hadn't written a check to make the problem go away. He had simply stood next to me in the silence until I found the strength to save myself. He was the fence post, but I was the wire. The concert ended. The lights came up. I walked out into the cool night air, my boots clicking on the concrete. I drove home the long way, taking the back roads. When I finally turned onto my property, the headlights swept across the entrance. The gate shone brilliant white in the beams. It stood straight and true. The sign hanging from it, freshly painted in black letters, read, "Reynolds Ranch, EST 1980. I parked the truck and stepped out. The night was quiet. No wind, no storm, just the gentle sound of cattle moving in the distance and the chirping of crickets. I walked to the mailbox. Inside was the monthly statement from Henry Vance's bank. I didn't dread opening it anymore. I tore the envelope open under the moonlight. Balance remaining $0. I had paid off the final installment of the high-risk portion that morning. The land was safe. The legacy was secure. I looked up at the stars, the vast, endless Texas sky. I thought about Thomas. I thought about the fear that had almost consumed me. And I thought about the man with the dusty boots and the quiet voice. "Thank you," I whispered to the empty road. The silence didn't answer back, but for the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt full. It felt like a promise kept. I turned and walked toward the house, the sound of my boots steady and strong on the gravel. I had a herd to check in the morning, I had a business to run, and I had a life to live loud and clear.